So I'm surprised that while we're talking about storylines and narratives, that you haven't brought up Suikoden, Chris.
There is a lot of great stuff in Suikoden. Some of the characters get glossed over a little more than most others, but when you have 108 recruitable characters in a game, granted not all of them actually join your party, some of them are like shopkeepers and stuff that you keep at your headquarters, but when you have that many characters and a giant plot, things get lost. You can't help that. But still, Suikoden 2 is considered by a lot of people up there as at least the top 10 best RPG stories of all time, if not some of the best stories of all time, because you've got all the drama of a Shakespearean play going on. You've got these two friends split apart because of a war, and basically one side's with one side, one side's with the other, and it's a clash of idealisms and morality and loyalty. It's an interesting plot. As much flack as Suikoden 3 got, this is actually one of the points I was going to bring up, is the different styles the stories are told in. Suikoden 3 did something really different that I've rarely seen in a video game, and that's your different chapters are broken up by your characters. So you have 3 choosable characters, but instead of, Resident Evil where you pick a character and you stick with them through the entire story, you're actually getting the story through that specific character until you move on to the next chapter, and in which case you can continue with that character or move on to a different one. And it comes across, probably not really explaining it well, but it comes across a lot like a Game of Thrones style of storytelling, where you have these opposing sides have their own stories to them, and eventually they start merging together until the final story takes place. And even better, I'm not going to spoil it, but the final chapter after you beat the game, you actually get to play as the villain and get the rest of the story that you might have missed. So it's just one of those awesome wow type of things.
It reminds me of Saga Frontier.
Yeah, that's another game that did something very, very similar to that. Live Alive, though it never came out in the US, did something very similar to that too.
I'm starting to like these, and more people are doing it, where you get to play as the villain. I'm starting to grow very fond of this idea.
The Sonic Adventures did that, where you could play Robotnik. And that was interesting. That was, of course, Super Mario RPG. You could play Koopa at one point, which, Bowser, Koopa, Bowser, whatever.
Yeah. I call him King Bowser Koopa. It gets it all.
So I remember in Maverick Hunter X for PSP, crappy system, great game, you could play as Vile through the first Mega Man X. And the story, you did the same stuff, but the story was different. You actually never fought Sigma. The last boss was Mega Man X. So that was pretty cool. It ended in such a way that if you chose to go through the game that way, it doesn't pollute or corrupt the rest of the Mega Man storyline. It all ends the same way. Vile still ends up getting defeated there.
So they don't have their own alternate parallel universe ending on it.
Right. Basically, you beat X, and because you had already beaten Zero, right? You end up beating X, and what happens is that, they do that little, I'm defeated, but I'm going to raise my gun at just the right level and blast you, and that's how you end up getting defeated. And then Sigma comes in. I don't remember exactly how it goes. Sigma comes in and says something to you, and then you're like, no, I'm stronger. But yeah, you don't actually ever fight Sigma. You end up being defeated by Zero.
Spoilers.
Yes. Well, it's been out for a while, so. But yeah, it's a good game, and this whole playing as the villain, having it actually tie into the storyline, I really like that idea, and I hope more games do that. It helps you kind of understand the character a little bit more.
Definitely.
An evil character is evil. Let's down to brass tacks. An evil character is just evil because he's evil. But you don't always know the motivations and stuff that he has. And sometimes they're not that interesting. Like Bowser from Mario Brothers. He just wants to kidnap princess. Okay, he's like the Ice King from Adventure Time. He just wants to kidnap himself a princess.
And he wants to go play on carts later on.
Yeah.
Kidnap. Mario defeats me. We're all gonna go karting later on.
And then a giant game board.
Get in some soccer, maybe some hoops.
Yes. I forgot about that basketball game. Yeah.
There's also a tennis game.
Yep. There's a few games that do that kind of repeating storyline, even if it's technically with different characters. Legend of Zelda is kind of famous for doing that, where it's basically the same tale over and over and over, but it's done in completely different ways every time.
Well, and the character it's all supposed to be within the same continuity, though different timelines.
Mm-hmm.
I always thought that they were just kind of rehashing the same story. Like, I knew some games were direct continuations of others, like Majora's Mask and Ocarina of Time. I knew that was a direct sequel, but I never understood until I started talking to somebody that was. He's probably one of the biggest Zelda fans I know. And he was just absolutely nuts about the timeline, especially the one that Nintendo released.
If I remember right, Wind Waker actually revealed a lot of the information behind that.
It did, because that was the point where the world was all covered in water, and it was mostly a large water world, basically.
But it was telling tales of past adventures of somebody very similar to himself.
Exactly. And they actually had the hero's clothes, is what they actually called the green tunic and the white spandex. Mm-hmm. That's called the hero's clothes. So it did start to, kind of help you think that maybe this has an actual storyline that they're trying to get ironed out. The storyline is it's weird because it splits, so it doesn't follow the same timeline.
I think Breath of Fire actually did a little bit of that too, because like Zelda, there's two characters that are always in every single game, and that was your hero and his love interest, Ryu and Nina. They were in every single one of the Breath of Fires. Now, how they exactly connected to each other, and it's a lot like Final Fantasy, I think, more in the sense that every time there's a standard sequel, that the world is completely different. There's a lot of familiar elements. There's always Moogles, there's always Chocobos, there's always Sid, etc. And a lot of times there's the crystals. There's a lot of tie-ins from others that's almost more of maybe a fan thing as much as it is just a series staple. But then you do have the Zeldas who seemingly have nothing to do with each other, and they drop these little hints that make you think there's more to it than just that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think there's quite as many of those, but that's largely because there's not as many repeating stories like that are as big and well known as Zelda.
Zelda's really one of the only ones that I know of. Like, Mario has always had pretty much the same storyline, but it's all contained in the same timeline. Mm-hmm. I think the problem with Zelda is that it's the whole split timeline. Like, I think there were 3 different timelines. They were called the child timeline, the fairy timeline, and the adult timeline. I don't know. It made it a lot more confusing.
Well, it's hard to tie in that many stories.
Especially when you didn't have a storyline when you started all. Just kind of save princess, do it.
In the instruction booklet to the original Legend of Zelda, it was actually a couple of pages long, which was unusual for anything but RPGs.
Well, yeah, I didn't mean that. The games themselves have a pretty good storyline, but they never really meant for them to connect with each other, is the way I was seeing it.
Looking at the timeline, there are 4 games that are all part of a sequence. Skyward Sword is the first game in the series. And then you have Minish Cap and 4 Swords and Ocarina of Time. And then from there, after Ocarina of Time, it splits off into 2 different areas. The path line where you fail in Ocarina of Time leads to A Link to the Past. And then Oracle of Seasons and Oracle of Ages, which are the 2 Game Boy Color titles. Mm-hmm. And then right after that is Link's Awakening. And that's part of the Hero is Defeated timeline. And then after Link's Awakening, The Legend of Zelda, the first one, and then The Adventure of Link, the second one. And then that ends that timeline. The hero is successful in Ocarina of Time, then it splits off into a child era and an adult era. And it's basically Twilight Princess is in the child era, which is weird. Because that was like, as far as the newer Legend of Zelda games.
I know that unlike Final Fantasy, that every single story is a different probably timeline as well.
As long as you ignore the Dissidia storyline, where they merge them all together.
Exactly.
Crossover.
Phantasy Star is the complete opposite, where every single one is them advancing further into the timeline.
Oh, yeah.
Even Phantasy Star Online.
Yep.
Even Phantasy Star 2 Online is doing the same thing.
And there's really no reason not to when you have a world set up the way they do.
Mm-hmm.
Worlds, plural. Star Ocean's the same way. Their stories are so completely different, but they're all based in the same universe.
Oh, that's such a complicated series.
I think I had that at one point on PSP. I believe Star Ocean was released. I think I sold it. Yeah.
I think the second one's the best one of the group, but I could be wrong. I haven't played all the way through 3, and 4 is a little strange.
I played the
think
first one, and I was just like, oh, this is going over my head. This is actually too complicated for me to play.
I think that's why I stopped. It's because I didn't really understand what was going on.
It's a lot like Star Trek meets Dungeons and Dragons, and it was a nice clash of cultures. You don't see that kind of stuff too often in video games, unless it's done for humor or alien invasions or something, or time travel.
Exactly.
We actually kind of touched on this briefly, and I almost went there, but we got on several different tangents, and that was playing as the bad guys in video games. Now, there's been actual times like Suikoden 3 or Breath of Fire 4 where there's moments where you actually do play as the bad guy for a short period of time. And then there's games that allow you to choose, like Knights of the Old Republic or Infamous, where you have this moral meter, or Fable is also a famous one for that, where you can play him as a good guy or you can play him as a bad guy. You can play him down the center, but usually that doesn't amount to anything story-wise or ability-wise. I was just kind of curious on what you guys thought of having that whole split of, depending on how you want to play a game, changing up not only your abilities, but the story too.
I liked it.
I think the system, as far as storyline goes, is inherently broken because there is no way. Well, there's no way to be a milquetoast hero. Basically, you can't be average. Some things are good, some things are bad.
And there's no varying degrees even in between that. You've just got the extremes.
You can't say this is my opinion and this is why. Like, I actually was trying to play Mass Effect at one point, getting every single Paragon point I could think of, and I did some things in the game that were considered bad by the game that I thought were good. So, it's just one of those, it should be, some things like that should be left open to interpretation, but when they put systems like that in the game, I think it kind of takes away from some of the narrative, sometimes, not all times, but for certain things, because it's too, what's the word I'm looking for? It's too,
biased.
That's close. Wow.
Situational?
That's part of it. It's not quite the word. I really cannot think of the word. It's when something is,
I
did. I've derailed myself. It's just, they have the game programmed to do certain things a certain way. You have to stick within that guideline too. What is that called? Where you have to stick within a guideline? No, overbearing is close to it. It's too.
You're basically following the rails of one path or the other. There's no real choice between the two. It's not really a multiple choice. It's just true or false.
I still can't remember the word, but pretty much that. It's. Oh god, it's gonna bug me. They have it set up a certain way, and you have to do it that way, or you don't get the progression that you're maybe wanting to get, or that you think you should get. It's like rules within rules. It doesn't pan out well, I think, personally, from a storytelling scenario. I think it's purely for if you want the good guy abilities, or if you want, like, force lightning, basically. It's like the difference between being able to tell somebody, these are not the droids you're looking for, or just being like, hey, screw you, and zap them with lightning.
Yeah.
Pretty much. That's really what it boils down to. And I think originally the intent was to have it done for story, and it never got programmed in beyond the either you're amazingly good or you're horribly evil.
That whole style of game is still kind of in its infancy, and most all of it was done by BioWare. I mean, we're seeing other companies dabble into it these days, but because you have to consider, if somebody's going to play a video game, they're generally only going to do it once unless they're really into it. So when you're making all these branching stories, especially if it's not just multiple endings like the awesome Chrono Trigger, but actual branching stories where the game can go completely different routes, you don't want to do too many variants of it because most people are never going to see it.
With the multiple endings, though, that's something that they could use that system for, but I don't really very often see it being used for that.
The later Fallouts are good for that, where you can be neutral.
I didn't choose a side yet for the Civil War in Skyrim, but there was the Civil War there, and as far as I know, that doesn't actually really affect the outcome of the main storyline.
No, it doesn't at all. You can just not even do it.
So that's kind of sort of along those lines. It's they put certain things in that are kind of contained within themselves and don't really reference it throughout the rest of the story. It's like, why have it in there? It's busy work. I don't like busy work, which is amazing because I play World of Warcraft and that is busy work. But when I'm playing a game other than World of Warcraft, I think it's because World of Warcraft is such a busy work kind of game, like where you're grinding for reputation or you're building your gear or whatever it is that it's in that game. It's all busy work. It helps that you have friends